I'm actually not going to take too much time with my background. I feel like I'd rather engage in the discussion, and if questions come up around that, I'm happy to address it. I'll just say briefly that I've been a licensed clinician for about 30 years, and it's probably in the last 10 to 15 range that I began to turn it all toward the climate crisis that we're in. So this is meant, this format, some of you may be familiar with it, is meant to be informal, mostly Q&A conversation, but it's such a big and deep topic. I thought I would do a very quick little introduction that also might spark some questions. So I'm planning to not take more than 15 minutes so we can mostly talk about this. So let me see if I can get my screen up here. All right, is everyone seeing the screen? I think the answer is yes.
Yes, good to go.
Okay. All right, so I need to move this over so I can see. Okay. So why talk about emotions and climate change? You know, I don't think that's too big of a question given the fact that you're here to talk about it. But you may also be aware that it's only newly emerging into this conversation, the importance of the psychological features of it. And they are very real, they are very present, they are very much an indicator based on our humanity and how we're wired that something is wrong, something is broken. And if you are paying attention and you're empathetic, that's exactly what you're going to feel, as a real myriad of emotional responses based on the losses that we're experiencing now and things that are projected to come as well. So I want to get friendly with emotions. And what I mean by that is I'd like to think of them as very natural, changing, and I'd like us to use chat for just a moment and ask you to write in, just in this moment right now, how you're feeling, especially as we approach this topic, in weather terms. And I put a few up here just to give you ideas, but you can use anything at all that comes to mind. So take just a moment for that. Just an emotional weather report check-in. Storm brewing, unpredictable. Not sure where we're going to go. Stormy. One reason I like darkness, one reason I like using weather is, and I'll talk a little more about this, but we get afraid of our feelings. You know, we get afraid of them, like if I let myself feel sad or I let myself feel angry, we're going to kind of fall into a pit and not know how to get out of it. But, and I'll say more about this, downpour, rain, they shift and change. And it's actually when we have a chance to acknowledge them, to express them, that they're more likely to flow. They're more likely to move and change because that's their nature. So I'd like to share with you some of the terms that are currently being used when it comes to feelings around the climate crisis. So one is called pre-traumatic stress condition. If you're tracking this at all, yes, it's definitely happening now, but a lot of people are aware that we are also on a trajectory with quite a bit of concern about where we're headed without quick and significant shifts. Ecological grief, and to understand that grief arises around any kind of loss in a sense of future, lost in the trust in our government response to the climate crisis, loss in literally the changes to the environment and the extinctions that are happening with the animals. certainly to people and communities, very real. Eco-anxiety, that fear that we face, especially with uncertainty about what's going to come or how it's going to come or when things are going to shift in a way that, especially as they get closer to us and tend to touch us directly. And a lot of people talk about what's called solastalgia, which is the environment around us is changing in a way that maybe the seasons aren't the same anymore, or the snow that you're used to seeing on the mountains where you live or travel to isn't there in the same way, or the lake that you used to swim in is now affected by toxic algae blooms. And so there's this feeling of longing for the environment as you have known it before, feeling of being homesick. Now, these terms are not commonly used, but what I appreciate about this is that people are struggling to find ways to talk about these layered and complex emotions that haven't quite existed in the same way before. So just to give you, I think what's more important than the terms is just kind of the description behind it. So the first one, empathetic blinch, is something like it's your birthday or a holiday and someone you care about gives you a lovely gift. But along with this gift comes a lot of waste, perhaps. Maybe it's wrapped in a bunch of stuff. Maybe the gift itself is not very environmentally friendly. And so you feel, on the one hand, the appreciation, maybe the love, the generosity of the person, and you're also feeling this distress at it kind of going against the values that you're working to live. Or blissinance is where, like in this picture, you might be enjoying a really gorgeous sunset, but you recognize that part of the colorfulness of what you're seeing, and the reason it's so vivid is because there's a lot of particulates in the air from wildfires, let's say, that are nearby, or different forms of pollution. So you're feeling, again, these conflicting feelings. And there's many, many kinds of experiences like this, where the way we're used to engaging with life are really met with ambivalence because of these layered experiences. So I don't want to take a lot of time with this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this study, but I wanted you to get a feel for how widespread this level of distress is. And this is a big study, came out about 2 months ago, and it interviewed youth in the age range of 16 to 25, 10,000 across 10 countries. And we'll just look at a couple of them here, and we can go to the US, which is on the far right, or the summary is on the far left. But the fact that the future is frightening, more than half, 68% in the US, higher globally. This one, and I'm not here to introduce a debate about, can we save ourselves or is it too late? But just emotionally, and the thoughts and feelings that are seizing people, and in this case, it's that age group. More than half believe globally that humanity is doomed, almost half in the US, and that the things that are valued most will be destroyed, more than half globally, close to half in the US. So I want to talk about feelings and how our brain amplifies them, because this is all tied into our evolutionary psychology. And we are not well equipped. We can learn these tools, and that's one of the things I try and provide, but we are not well equipped to deal with uncertainty, which of course is huge in the climate crisis. And what we do, often unconsciously, is want to jump onto some place where we can land, rather than feeling this uncomfortable, I don't know place. And so there's this spectrum where denial, which we're familiar with, although that is a shrinking number, or disavowal means, you're aware the climate crisis is happening, but you sort of turn a blind eye, and it's you operate with business as usual, as if it weren't happening. And then on the other side, kind of what we were looking at with the youth study is doomism. It's just too late. And the point I want to make here is that to go to either of these ends of the continuum, when many scientists are telling us there's a lot that's unfolding and we don't quite know where we're going to go, is that it's an effort to get out of the feeling of emotional overwhelm. That feeling that it's just too much and it's just too big and it's always kind of overshadowing us is too much for our nervous systems and our thoughts and our feelings to bear. And so we look for a place to land. Now, for most of us, we may slide in and out of this, right? There are times when we have to attend to other things. Life demands that of us. And I'm not necessarily saying we should constantly be in a state of distress, but I want you to be aware of the way that our nervous systems kick us out of distress. And it's why sometimes like denial or disavowal might look like apathy or that someone doesn't care, when often it's under the hood, underneath in our psychology, that it's actually an expression of overwhelm. They don't know what to do and they can't really be with the feelings that are being generated. And this creates kind of a difficult spiral because until we can expand our bandwidth, so to speak, to be with more, it's actually hard to regulate our emotions. And this is sort of an unconscious attempt to do that. The other thing that our brain does, and this is built in as part of our survival mechanism, is it amplifies negative news and negative experiences. And again, I want to be careful and clarify that by all means, the climate crisis is severe, and it's significant. And I don't want to in any way diminish it in talking about this. But it's also good to know that, and this really came out of survival in the sense of, being on the savannah and kind of looking for threats in our environment. We developed a heightened sensitivity to threats and risks. So much so that they think it's about 3 to 5 times registers with us in terms of how it affects us than a neutral or positive event. And, this is not just climate change. It's, in fact, a lot of this work came out of relationship studies, so that in a relationship, if you have an argument or a distressing interaction, it's not balanced out with one positive one. It's 3 to 5 times the needing to reinvest in what's good to come back to a neutral place. So one thing this tells us about facing something like climate change is we have to be a little bit more proactive in seeking out what's working, who is doing really good work, where are there changes that are going in the right direction, and not to forget that as we look at the whole picture. So let me talk a little bit more about feelings. I was saying that, at least in our predominant Western culture, we still have a lot of bias against feelings. It's like if we feel something uncomfortable or we feel bad or we think of it as a negative emotion, we do everything to kind of keep it at bay. And the thought is, if we give in to it, it'll just end up being a waste of time. You know, it'll zap my energy. I'll fall into this pit of despair and never be able to get out, or I'll break out into an outrage and it won't be productive. But just the opposite is true. You know, I was talking about feelings that move like the weather. And if something is arising, our emotions are signals. Again, it's telling us something is wrong. It's an uh, important part to engage with, because it's a human experience to the impact we're having on the environment and each other. And to try and numb it or keep it at a distance or deny it is really doing a disservice to ourselves and addressing the larger picture, and could be part of what got us into this also. A lot of parts of our humanity have sort of gone offline, including our emotional intelligence. So neuroscience tells us that if our emotions are acknowledged as they arise, maybe even thanked for the messengers they are, that it makes it easier for them to flow, and it will give us more energy to engage in the work and that we can all do towards sustainability. And you might think of it this way, you know, if you have a ball and you're trying to hold it underwater and all it wants to do is pop up to the surface, it takes a lot of your attention, a lot of your strength to keep it down, and eventually, you know, you'll fatigue and give out and it'll pop up anyway. And that's what happens with our emotions, is that if we don't work with them consciously, they'll come out sideways. They'll come up anyway. So I really like this quote by Caroline Hickman. She was actually one of the researchers behind that large study that I quoted of the 16 to 25-year-old group. And she says we need to not only grow up in the climate crisis by cultivating imaginative, creative, determined, hopeful capacities, but we also need to grow down and build a tolerance for guilt, for shame, for anxiety, for depression. And let's talk a little about how to do that. So this is a concept that comes out of trauma studies. And those two parallel lines are called the window of tolerance or the zone of resilience. And the idea is that most of the time, most of us are operating in between those lines, meaning maybe we have decisions to make and things to accomplish and conversations to engage in. And, you know, we mostly have our wits about us and can address those pretty well. But if there's too much stress or too intense of a stress, or we've shrunk our zone of resilience, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and we go outside of that, we either get reactive and go into kind of a lashing out knee-jerk reaction, or we tend to numb out and drop out and kind of wall off, and we just can't hear anything anymore. And again, this is probably very relatable. Again, if you've had a difficult conversation with someone and both of you are kind of heated in an argument, it's kind of common sense to take a cooling off period. Just step back and come back later and see if you can start again and re-engage, because literally parts of our brain go offline when we're outside our zone.
At all.
Do not have the same capacity.
For the nervous system.
Well, maybe it's, I guess, responding to.
Thank you for muting. When it comes to climate change too, one way to help work with this is what's called toggling. So especially if you're doing any of this work or you're following any of this work, it's important to notice your edges and then step back and work with something that helps you to regulate your nervous system. And that can look like many, many things, from mindfulness to going for a run to calling a friend. But to be aware, again, of consciously working on that zone of resilience. And we can stretch it. We can learn to stretch it. And even things like not enough sleep, or not eating well, all kinds of things can shrink it also. And again, if you think about this, if you've had 3 or 4 nights of not very good sleep, it's a lot harder to deal with the things that are coming to you in that day. So I've been redefining emotional resilience when it comes to the climate breakdown. Because the conventional definition, if you look it up, is the ability to bounce back from a stressful experience and kind of get back in your life and keep going. The problem with this, and why I feel like it needs to be thought of a little differently, is we know with climate change, there's no going back. There's not going back to the way we have known life before. There are going to continue to be new things that we face, new challenges, new experiences. So I'm proposing that we think of emotional resilience more as cultivating the ability to remain present and open-minded and empathetic in the face of increasing stress, and to grow the ability to bear witness to and be with more. I'm going through this quickly because I want to allow time for conversation. So I'm sure I'm generating some questions with this. I want to introduce one other really important concept, which is that our feelings are contagious, which is a way that we can really support each other. We've learned that our nervous systems literally begin to attune to each other. So think of this. Let's say you're in a small group of friends and you're chatting, and somebody walks into the room and joins you who you can tell is really agitated or upset. Very easy to feel how those feelings ripple through the group. Or the reverse, you may have a friend where it doesn't really matter what you do or where you go or what you talk about. You just always feel kind of good, or you feel better, or you can be yourself. And that is happening on this other level, on the level of the nervous system. And I like to put it in the context of self-care, because anything that we do to bring ourselves into that zone of resilience, into our window of tolerance, we are also doing that supports the people around us. So self-care is really community care, and vice versa. We're not always going to be the person who can kind of bring that. Sometimes we're going to need that. But if we're all engaged in this, it's something that we can elevate each other by our very presence. So in the same way that when we look at climate change solutions, we can't only look at things like how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere or stop spewing as much into the atmosphere, which we know is one of the primary causes here. And that has certainly to be part of it. But what has led to this? What has led to the fact that for 50 years or more, we have already known about the impact of carbon in the atmosphere? That even with the way things are becoming more severe now, the responsiveness is slow. And I'm talking politically, systemically, and within individuals. And some of this, I think we could look at this as that some of the breakdown in our external world mirrors a breakdown in our internal landscapes, our internal ecosystems, meaning that we have very little emotional intelligence we're bringing to this. We often don't have a creative or intuitive engagement. We're a very hyper individualistic society versus the need for this collective support and collective wisdom. There's a lot that our body can tell us, our history can tell us, things that actually change potentially our DNA by spending more time in the wild. And so and part of it is my training. So this is my area of emphasis, but that along with these solutions, we need to use this time to embrace more of our humanity, to really look at what does it mean to be human? And that a lot of the ways we have shut these things down are culturally learned and can be unlearned. And that this is an important part of our journey. It can't be just kind of moving things around on the same level, but we could potentially embrace this breakdown as a necessary step in bringing a lot more forward. So I'm going to pause there. I have some resources that I could share at the very end, but I do want to now open this up to dialogue, questions, and conversation. So there's a couple ways we can do it. You're welcome to just unmute and jump in. You can put a question in chat.
So thank you. I think I missed your last slide with the resources. I don't know if you can go back to that one or whether we'll get this as a recording.
I was gonna just save that one until the end, just to
Oh,
allow
okay.
time for conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I will
Perfect, thank you.
bring it back up. I will bring it back up. Yeah.
Hi, Leslie. My name is Brooke, and I'm going to stay off video because I'm at someone else's house and they've asked me to stay off video.
Okay.
But that was just a wonderful summary of a variety of really key points. Thank you so much. And I worked in environmental health and climate for 25 years and then went to the Harvard Kennedy School. And, having been a national director, I left that job to go to the Kennedy School, and it had been all action, action, action. And I love that you're bringing in this, the need for resilience, the need to embrace humanity, because that's where my focus has now been over the last 8 years, and really working to try to identify how to offer to people in general, but activists in particular, some tools around self-resiliency. And to me, part of that is the intellectual brain, so the science that you provided. And part of that are skills. You mentioned mindfulness, et cetera. So one of the things I've been playing with is identifying sort of what I call nuggets. It's forming the bridge. How do you form, this is what I've been thinking about. How do you form the bridge from someone that currently, and I, was like this for 25 years. I would love to meditate for an hour in the morning, an hour at night, but people are dying and I'm very busy right now. And so I think it's that understanding that one doesn't need to meditate for an hour in the morning, an hour at night. That's great if you can and want to, but 10 minutes is great. A minute of silence or stillness at the beginning of a meeting is tremendously impactful. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or suggestions or can point me somewhere for more of these sort of mini practices that I would really like to begin bringing into the activist community in particular, and then also more generally.
Yes, thank you. There's so many things I want to respond to. And what you said, my head's kind of going off. But first, let me thank you for raising this. And I'm also really encouraged to say that there does seem to be a growing receptivity. And I'll just use my own experience. I've been getting more and more requests to do things like a lunch presentation for nonprofits, or a training program for staff who work in this field. And I'm so encouraged by this, because it feels like there is the beginning of this understanding of, especially if we want to stay in this for the long run, how absolutely essential this is. And because it's still a shifting mindset, I often do begin with a little bit of educational stuff related to what I was talking about. And I try and put it in really understandable terms. And one thing I talk about is the training of athletes. So in the most recent training of athletes, a real emphasis is on the necessity of recovery time. So if any of you are runners, cyclists, any kind of sport, you know, if Olympic athletes are not hitting their training goals, the first thing coaches look at now is, are you using your recovery time well and the way it's designed? Which is not conceptualized as stepping away from your training. It's integral to the training. And it's not just giving your muscles a time to rest, but it's all that focus of mind and emotions that aim for peak performance. And when it comes to activism, you know, there's so much passion and urgency that it can sort of be like, okay, I see this race happening, I'm going to join the race because I believe in this too. But without that kind of training, you kind of run till you drop, you know, and it doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve what you're aiming to do, to not have an understanding about skills, which includes built-in recovery times, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So I just want to share that as sort of a context for those who are, you know, still have that mindset of I can't waste any time on me because people are dying and things have to happen, but you can't, it's unsustainable. And if we're looking at sustainability, we have to look at it psychologically as well as environmentally. We really cannot separate these dimensions of our internal and our external landscapes. So, and then in terms of specific tools, you're right, the mindfulness realm, which is so vast, has so many that can be done briefly. Now, sometimes it's worth investing a longer time so that you get familiar with how to kind of drop down into a calmer place. But you're right, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of breath work, noticing if your shoulders have crept up by your ears and how to drop them down, learning how to release the thoughts that are just on a hamster wheel in our minds that are no longer being productive. So depending how many questions there end up being, I could even guide us through a couple of brief little tools. And while I personally love the full spectrum of mindfulness work, I also try and help people really find the match that's good for them. You know, so I say for some people it might be sitting quietly, and for others it might be kickboxing, right? Because what we want to do is reset the nervous system, and there are so many ways to do it. That it doesn't have to look in a particular way. But when it comes to science, our breathing is a tremendous reset to our nervous system if we can do it consciously and can do it fully. In fact, I'm just going to take 2 minutes right now and do something with you, and I'm going to encourage you to follow along. And if you don't want to, that's fine too. It'll really be 2 to 3 minutes max, but I'm going to ask you to sit in a way where your feet are on the floor and to either close your eyes or let them just have kind of a soft focus. And I would like you to glance back for a moment at some of the activities in your day, your morning, or things you were doing before this meeting. And just view them like a little snapshot or a short video clip. And then let all of those activities drift way off to the edge of your awareness. You can retrieve them later, but really recognize that they're part of your past. And a similar thing, take just a moment to look at your evening, things you're likely to do, maybe conversations you're likely to have, all that planning and anticipation. And let all of that drift way off to the edge because it actually lives in the future. Just trust that when those moments arrive, you can attend to them at that time. And just acknowledge to yourself how this moment now has never been experienced before. It actually is arising fresh and unmarked. And probably relatively peaceful if you keep past and future thinking off to the side a little longer. And I'd like you to just take a couple of full breaths, breathing in that awareness of the quietness of this moment, letting it fill your body and fill your mind. And then breathe out just as completely. A few more times, just that. Nourishing your body on the in-breath, a very simple way. And breathing out, keeping it full but comfortable. It's finding a pace that feels easy for now. We're just going to do this a few more times. But notice this ancient rhythm of filling up and emptying out. It's ancient in the sense that it's reflected in the ebb and flow of tides, in the turning of seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, filling up and emptying out. Feel how we are part of those rhythms. We're meant to operate in that same natural rhythm. Okay, at the end of your next exhalation, just notice how you're feeling in your body, your mind, your heart. And then open your eyes again. Okay, so that I didn't really watch the clock, but I bet it wasn't more than 3-4 minutes, you know, and it can often shift dramatically. If someone's new to it, it sometimes takes a little longer to settle, but you know, I often say don't wait to start digging the well until you're really, really thirsty. Right? Like if we build these tools now, if we take some time to meditate when we're not that stressed, it's going to be easier to tap into that when we really need it, when we're really being challenged. And let's see, in terms of resources, I know that was part of your question. There are an awful lot of like mindfulness workbooks and things out there. And when we get to the resource list at the end, I did include a couple of books that I wrote that are very experientially oriented. So I could wait and say a little bit more about that.
So I have some questions that came in via email and also on the registration.
Okay.
I'll start with the first one. It's a little long. I'll also put it in the chat. But last year's protests against the murder of George Floyd were perhaps the biggest protests this country has ever seen. Something like 10 to 20 million people participated in them. So given those huge numbers, do you think there might be a significant potential for climate change activists to connect with the Black Lives Matter movement, or are the focuses of the movements too different?
Really good question. Personally, I don't think we can separate what needs to happen in addressing climate without including a social justice perspective. We are talking about unjust systems, which includes environmental racism. So I absolutely think they can be brought together. I absolutely do. I think it's essential.
I agree. Thank you. All right. So then someone also asks, how do we continue to engage with this critical issue without getting too depressed and overwhelmed?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, but it's kind of like the essence of what I'm trying to get at here. And so I'm kind of saying we need to do two things. We need to make room for these feelings, that it's okay to not feel okay sometimes. And if we give ourselves room to feel that when it's bubbling up, it's less likely to linger and just be what we're feeling all the time. We also, as I was talking about that negativity bias, we need to intentionally invest in the good work that other people are doing and connect with other people so that we don't feel like we're shouldering this ourselves. Because remember that statistic is, it takes 3 to 5 times of an effort to look at what might be good, to just balance it out with all the difficult news that is coming our way. And it's why a lot of therapists encourage things like gratitude journals. You know, we're there to kind of help make things better and get through some difficult things, but let's not lose track of what's working well and what you can be grateful for and what you can enjoy. And then the other part, as we've just been adding, is how can you also learn some tools so that, you know, if you can't sleep at night, what might help you release the stories going through your mind, or calm your body and nervous system, or intentionally take a break so that you can come back a bit more energized. So I think it's really, you know, all these threads coming together that are important pieces. Because as we've been sort of saying, you know, there's a bit of a polarization. There's a lot of the activists who go, 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 and have a harder time with self-care. And then there's also a big, you know, meditation wellness community that I'd like to get more involved in being part of meaningful change, and to kind of bring those two groups together so we've all got all of those parts engaged.
You mentioned connecting with folks. What do you do if large parts of your family or friends are not engaged in the climate movement and do not understand it? How do we have these conversations, and how do we mindfully have these conversations and not get just overwhelmed and defeated?
Yeah. Yeah, so a few thoughts on this. One is, this is a bit oversimplified, but there's, you know, the folks who are engaged and really recognize the importance of this, and all of you who are on this call, I'm sure, are part of this. There's a group over on the other end. If they're not deniers, they might just take the attitude of, oh, well, someone is going to figure this out. You know, I'm not, they don't need me. But in the middle is, I think, often a fruitful area for conversation. It's people who maybe don't have all the info, or starting to wake up to this, or want to do something but don't know what to do or how to get involved, or you know, maybe there could be engagement around something that really matters to them, rather than embracing it on a global scale. Maybe if they want to focus on local clean air for their kids, at least it's a place in that might grow or shift over time. The other thing I think is really important is, similar to the fact that our self-care can look like so many things. You know, it can look like kickboxing or meditating. I think advocacy needs to be embraced in a really large view as well. I do think civic action is essential because we are talking about systems shifts. However, if it's someone, for example, who maybe is a teacher in the school system, maybe they can work on climate curriculum. Maybe they can start an after-school green club. If it's someone in the arts, maybe they can use their creative expression to include messaging that will reach certain people because of the artistic outlet is a better way to communicate. So I think it's very challenging and perhaps not too fruitful to try and convince that uncle who's already dug his heels in and has what I call a Teflon mind. It doesn't matter what you say, it just slips right off, because there's not a lot of traction there. But I do think there's a lot of room for people who are, oh, I'm kind of getting what is happening. I'd like to do something, and to connect around them, how they could join you, or conversations about how they can discover a way to become involved. So that's my thoughts on that one.
Thank you. And then Jeff had a question too. Does the fact that that there are so many nonprofits that say they're fighting climate change add to the confusion with new? I'm sorry, another one is added. So does the fact that there are so many nonprofits that saying they're fighting climate change add to the confusion with new climate change fighters? What can we do to help the confused newcomer?
Jeff, would you be willing to say a little bit more about that? Because I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at.
You know, I've been to a lot of conferences, and no disrespect, but there's just so many people starting up nonprofits, and the president and the vice president or founders usually do very well. So it actually hurts us as a climate change community to have you spread out, you weaken, you thin out your crop by having all these nonprofits. So a lot of the students I know, people that are just getting into it, some of the adults, they get so overwhelmed with so many ways to help the ocean, so many ways to help the pets, so many Black Lives Matter type of organizations that they kind of get washed out. And I don't know how to describe it, but I love to hear your input, because I always hear from the nonprofits, the schools, and those type of organizations. But I love to have your input on how can we help the people that are overwhelmed with so many choices.
Yeah, I now I understand what you're saying. It is a big, complex problem, and you're right. You know, even the suggestion I was just saying about, you know, if someone's a school teacher, maybe they can introduce something at the school. In a way, it's a mistake to keep reinventing the wheel versus aligning with people who have maybe already developed a curriculum or already, you know, making those inroads. And how can we join forces rather than splinter? So, and I think in a way it's a little bit of a fine line though as well, because I do think there needs to be some variation in how people can be involved and get engaged. But you're right, it's probably a reflection of, you know, what I was saying earlier of being such a hyper individualistic society. Oh, we've got an idea, I'm going to make it, you know, I'm going to make it happen, versus the ways of reaching out and connecting. Because you're right, there's a lot of really good work happening, and the more we can, you know, focus it, the more effective it's going to be. But in terms of helping individuals, maybe it is just, you know, if you're more knowledgeable about the effectiveness of certain organizations, or how long they've been established and what they can do, just to act as something of a guide. I would think somebody would find that really helpful, who's kind of new to it and just like wanting to do something but not knowing the lay of the land. That could maybe be a gift you could offer, depending on, you know, you sounds like you work with students where they come in with that kind of question. Yeah, I don't know if there's like a resource hub that does any of that or not. kind of any of that summary and sorting out, but yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm. Is there a new question up there, Erin?
Yeah, I've got two. So one that came in via email, and then Sarah also has one in chat. The other one was, do you see any correlation between mental health issues and lack of green space or living in a concrete jungle? That is a fantastic question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and actually there's some really good research on that too. And the whole field of what is referred to as ecopsychology is very specifically focused around the effects of being in green space or wild space compared to not. There's a direct correlation, 100%. Yes. Yes, and again, I think in a way that's a good example of this larger point I want to make, which is that we can't divorce, we can't separate and sever our external environment with our internal states and vice versa. It has to be this human oriented dimensional way of addressing the environmental concerns. They're linked. What we feel affects what we believe, which affects how we act, which affects how we see people and things. Are we going to see a tree as a commodity, or are we going to see it as this living energy that cleans the air and affects the temperature and just does all these things that if we just have certain lenses in front of our eyes, we lose all of that, and all this is interrelated.
Thank you. And then Sarah said, hi everyone, Sarah here, an environmental arts therapist from Nelson, BC, supporting folks experiencing ecological grief. How do you best support people who may be experiencing moral injury, people who care for the protection of the planet and are aware of climate change but unable to engage to the fullest extent they'd like, i.e. guilt over personal use of resources, different environmental values of employer?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm part of the answer is in that question, which is that again, we're a grief averse culture, and we sometimes need to grieve that we can't do more, that there are these inequities in the system that we want to right, and a lot of people want to right them, and it may happen. There's kind of a growing awareness and a growing energy in that. But there needs to be a place to unpack this in a safe way. In other words, the very first thing to help move all that's being described is to validate it. I see you. I get why you're feeling this way. I feel this way too. It's really hard. And, for me personally, sometimes I'll read a study or an article, and I will just have some time for tears, not every time, but sometimes it's just the tipping point, or I'm just a little bit less resourced that day. And when it comes, I've just been giving into letting it flow, because healthy emotions are emotions that flow. So the fact of having a group like that does say, again, what you're feeling is valid, it is frustrating, it is difficult, let's be with that, and let's find ways to replenish ourselves, because this requires taking a longer look, a longer arc than we wish it had to. Wouldn't it be great if all of our efforts, we could see the results? But that isn't quite how this works most of the time. And then it's good to remember little things like, we don't know how far reaching our efforts go. It might feel like we've given a talk, or we've done a project, or we've painted a mural, or we've done a march, or whatever it is. And, you know, it seems like nothing happened, but we don't always know that. There are many seeds that get planted. I have people circling back to me years later who say something came out of hearing something or reading something. And I'll give you one example, and I realize we're getting really close to time here. When I do one-on-one therapy, it often feels too small to me, and I do like to work in larger venues. But I worked with a person very big in the environmental world who had quite an intense speaking phobia. So this person could draw crowds to a televised 3,000 seat auditorium, but that person couldn't do it without working through what he was able to in our work together. And I'm mentioning that because it's like the seed that gets planted, right? My little part in that quiet room with no one else around is linked to his ability to be on a stage and to have it be broadcast and to have it ripple out into the benefits that come from that. And I say that as one of just many, many examples of in whatever ways you're working, you don't know kind of truly what the outcome is. And it can be, it's a good reminder when it feels like you wish you could see more of the results of what you're doing in a more immediate way. So I promised to put up some resources. I'm going to do that while, as I see we're about at our time. So what this is, the list on the right, let me start there. Unfortunately, any kind of therapist, psychologists, social workers, marriage family therapists, none of them are required to have training in climate work, in spite of everything I've just told you. So there is a directory now forming for people who have pursued this themselves, are concerned about it, who've taken some training, who've considered deeply. So the Climate Aware Therapist Directory, if you're looking for a therapist, it includes across the US and international. Climate cafes, climate circles, and the Good Grief Network are all ways outside of traditional therapy that people are gathering to get support from more of a peer-oriented way of just being with these feelings. What works for me? What's worked for you? Let's just talk about where we are and what we're feeling. There tend to be either very low cost, some of them are free, and these are a few examples: climate cafes, climate circles, Good Grief Network. And then I put it the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is just a good resource of workshops and talks and more information you could read about related to climate psychology. And these two books on the left I wrote. The first one was written for clinicians, but it is a very friendly, easy to read book, and it has a lot of practices. And the second one, All the Feelings Under the Sun, is kind of the same book translated for 8 through 12-year-olds. So it's vetted climate science paired with emotional resiliency tools. I'll leave that up a bit longer in case any of you are jotting down notes.
2 points on that. I read the emotional resiliency in the era of the climate change, and definitely not a clinician, but it was incredibly helpful for me. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. And Leslie, you sent me this PowerPoint. I'm recording this and we post these on YouTube, and also I send out an email after this with the recording and any resources we might have discussed. Is it okay if I put this PowerPoint in that email?
100%. Yes.
All right, so no need to furiously jot down all of those things. I will send this. Though sometimes I have issues sending PowerPoints, so hopefully that all goes through. Otherwise, I'll post it to Dropbox and send you all that link. Thank you all for your participation. I feel better already. I'll need to meditate a little bit more tonight and let this all kind of sink in more. I really appreciated this. This was incredibly fun and impact my things. So thank you
Thank-
all, and I hope you have a great Monday.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. Bye-bye.
Bye.